Hello and welcome to FireDEV, a fireside chat with developers and people just in general in the industry. Today we have Nathaniel Barker that has a ton of experience with us. So I just want to thank Nate for joining us. So thank you, Nate.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
No problem. So I'm gonna go right back to the start of your career. You worked at Disney. What did you do there, and how was the interview process for Disney?
Sure. So I started my career at Disney Mobile. Disney at that time had just acquired a company called Tapulous, which was one of the first mobile game developers for smartphones. Um, Disney had a fairly long history of buying or building their own games, either for the web. They built a bunch for feature phones, and Tapulous kind of came in right as the iPhone was launching. And essentially, their strategy was pretty clever. They bought 30 different apps, had no idea they wanted to make games, and then launched them all and saw which one did the best, which is actually kind of now a strategy that you see with a lot of hyper casual developers who just make a bunch of things and see whatever sticks. And so that was essentially their strategy. And in their case, a game that was really similar to Guitar Hero or Dance Dance Revolution took off, and that was called Tap Tap Revenge. It was enormously successful. They quickly grew to accommodate all of the players. They needed a bunch of engineers, a lot of artists, bit on game design and sound design, and some business people to handle all of the relationships with the artists. And then I came along to help with the community management. So my interview process was a bit funny because they wanted me to apply for essentially two jobs at one time. So I interviewed with the marketing folks for community management, and I interviewed with the business folks for a more business development kind of project planning role. And my skill set didn't really match the business side, but I was like a fresh grad right out of university. But the job that worked pretty well with my skill set was community management. And they asked me relatively simple questions about how I would care for customers, how I would handle complaints, how I would compare their game with other competitors on the industry, what I thought were good examples of good community management, and then they had me do a sample of what I would do for a particular artist, how I would arrange their community management. And so what I remember from that is that it was really helpful that I had a background in retail sales. So I used to work at the Apple Store, and I sold iPhones when they first came out. And so Apple was really, really good at training people something called the Ritz-Carlton method, which is a way to um, handle what you might call like really high value customers. And Apple looked at how Ritz-Carlton worked with their really high value customers and said, okay, we'll do this with every customer that comes into the Apple Store. And they trained us on this. One of the core essentials is basically sticking with the customer at every step of the way, saying, oh, for instance, a customer comes in and, or a guest at a hotel would come in and say, I want to go to a fancy restaurant tonight and I need some place to store my bags while I do that. Okay, so you walk with them over to the concierge and you talk to the concierge and you say, hi, this is Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones wants to go to a fancy restaurant, and you stick with them, and then the concierge gets them a booking. Then you walk over with the customer to the bag drop, and you give them a bag ticket, or you help them out there. And then, it finally ends after all of that is done with the customer or with the guest, and then you've completed your task. You can move on to the next guest. And that's a really essential concept when it comes to customer care, because it makes sure that A, information isn't lost, and B, the customer generally feels better. So I basically told them essentially that. And then I told them a concept I had for there's a band called Guar, um, that is sort of like a metal band that's it's kind of like I don't want to say like a joke band, but they're definitely more theatrical. They dress up in really big costumes and they do all sorts of like blood and guts related things. It's great for Halloween, and they wanted content for that, so I essentially pitched a bunch of ideas around like, here's how you can, get all sorts of like blood and guts and satanic imagery and blah 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 into this a social media contest. And it sounded like actually they were going to end up doing a lot of the things that I had pitched coincidentally. So it was a good interview, and then I got hired.
Okay, that's pretty interesting. So, why did you leave such a big company like Disney? Because for many, that is like it's the pinnacle of where they want to be. They look up to Disney, Google, Facebook, and they say, I wish I could work there one day. But for you, it's merely the start of your career.
Yeah, Disney was a great place to start my career, and I learned some of the most valuable lessons in my career starting there. It was an incredibly fast-paced place to be because they were in the middle of a transition from being a startup, which was Tapulous, to being acquired by Disney. So there was a lot that was going on. So it was a kind of a cool hybrid between a startup where you can kind of do whatever you want and the sky is the limit, and also here's a corporate environment where there's a set of it's like a clear corporate hierarchy that goes all the way up to the C level, and Bob Iger, the CEO of Disney. Here's the what the board thinks, all these things, and you have this like enormous corporate structure, like lawyers and all sorts of stuff around you. So that was really cool to see. And ultimately, what I decided I wanted was an opportunity to be. I like the startup side of that. So ultimately, I decided I wanted to be more on the startup side and less on the big corporate side. So I got an offer from somebody else who I had worked with at Disney, who was starting a new company, and she needed a person to handle business development for her. So I said, okay, that looks really cool. I'm going to miss Disney, but this seems like a step forward in my career, and maybe one day way in the future, like you say, I can settle back at a big corporate like Disney, which has all sorts of awesome advantages. But yeah, I decided to move on over to that company, and that was called Chartboost, and that was like the next step in my career.
Okay, and so whilst you worked at Chartboost, that's actually where we met. And what did you do at Chartboost? And for those that don't know, what is Chartboost? I think for a lot of mobile, especially game developers, they know, but other developers and other people listening, they may not know what it is.
Sure. Chartboost is a mobile ad network. It originally pitched itself as a little bit more of a platform, but I think it settled safely into the mobile ad network category. So if you're not really familiar with the way that ad networks work, essentially what Chartboost did was to connect um, advertisers, so folks who want to show an ad, with publishers, who are people who want to make money by showing ads. Like maybe they have a game and they want to make some money off that, and then Chartboost is all of the tech that makes that happen. They give the software or the SDK to both sides of the advertiser and the publisher, and ensure that there's a functioning ad algorithm that works between that, so that you're always showing ads to the right people at the right time in the right place. Chartboost was recently acquired by Zynga, which is really great, and is now becoming part of Zynga's larger platform strategy for how they can kind of create a content fortress around all of their games and tech. And when I was at Chartboost, I there's like a bit of static there. I don't know if you can hear it.
I mean, I can't hear it. It should be fine because I'll be all edited post if there's any issues.
Okay, cool. Um, so I'll just start with one, two. While I was at Chartboost, I worked on the business development side. My focus was on indie developers. So I wanted to ensure that people who were on the medium to long tail of Chartboost customer base were happy with the platform, had everything they needed. I could answer any of their questions, which meant that I wasn't necessarily working most of the time with big companies like a Zynga or like Disney, but instead it was on a lot of folks who were very new to the app and game industry, and were kind of figuring things out in mobile just at the same time that we were. I did a bit of sales. I also did a bit of marketing where I went around to a few different cities in Europe, and we put on educational events to help people who were just coming into the industry understand the ins and outs of mobile advertising.
Okay, so afterwards you worked at Linekong Interactive Group. What did you do there, and like why did you leave Chartboost? Because I think you was there for about 3 years, if I'm correct.
I was at Chartboost for 4 years, and I um, I had been living in, honestly, I actually blame some of the events that we did when we were on the marketing side. We part of the event series that we did, we went to London and Berlin, Barcelona, and Stockholm, and going on that marketing, like that marketing series, that roadshow that we put on, essentially opened my eyes to how much more of the world I had not yet seen. Earlier in the summer, before I went on all of those, I went on a vacation that kind of hit many of the same cities, and I kind of quickly discovered like, wow, like I've been living in the U.S. my entire life. I grew up in San Francisco, so when I started working, I was working in the Bay Area, and I was working in like a very working and living in like a really small bubble. It's like a little tech bubble in the Bay Area, and it feels like it's the center of the universe because there are so many big companies that you hear about that were making a lot of waves at the time. Obviously, Apple, but also Facebook and Twitter and PayPal and all these companies were there. And Microsoft had an office and or several, and all of these video game companies were popping up suddenly, and it felt like it was taking over the world. And it feels like, oh, like wow, like I'm where it's at, where it's supposed to be. This is so cool. But then you realize once you get out into the rest of the world that actually there's a lot more going on. There's a lot more stories and human experiences to have. And I decided at that point that I needed to get out of the Bay Area and go explore a bit. So I kind of lined up for myself three different opportunities. One was in New Zealand, and it was a job that was super cool, but I didn't really want to live in New Zealand for more than like a month because it just seemed like I'd get a bit tired of it. One was in Berlin, which is where I am now, but for a different company. And I really liked Berlin, but I didn't really like the job opportunity that I had. And the final one was in Taiwan, doing marketing. And I was like, okay, well, marketing is pretty cool. I have experience there. It's for a mobile game company, which is what I like. And I know absolutely nothing about Taiwan, but it seems like it would be a pretty different place to live. So if I want to get something novel and new and exciting, that's going to be the route there. So it was entirely a lifestyle decision. I really enjoyed the work that I did at Chartboost, and I still am super close with a lot of people who currently work there, but I just needed to get out and see the world. So I ended up going over to Taipei and working at Linekong, where I led a marketing team, and we worked on um, launches for mobile games that this Linekong sorry, we worked on launches for mobile games that this Linekong subsidiary was doing that were things, anything ranging from a fashion game to a Rocket League sort of game to a partnership that we did with Fox for an Independence Day mobile game that was super cool. So we worked on a bunch of projects there. Unfortunately, the studio ran out of money and wasn't able to raise again. And so I left from that after only a year, which was really disappointing because I was enjoying being out in Taiwan, and bounced back to the US for just like a really short time to help out a friend's company. And then went to Berlin to work essentially at Ubisoft for 5 years.
Okay, and you said Line Kong wasn't able to raise any more funding to keep going. Was it Line Kong itself, or was it that subsidiary that you was talking about?
Yeah, that's a good distinction. So Linekong itself is quite large, and it's a profitable company based in mainland China. Um, I think they have offices in Shanghai and maybe Beijing. They owned and operated this subsidiary that was first headquartered in Burlingame, which is in California. And then that subsidiary opened up its own secondary subsidiary in Taipei. The reason being that the some of like the executive staff of the subsidiary either were Taiwanese or were Chinese, and recognized that there was a lot of developer talent in Taiwan, and it would make sense to hire out there. It was a little bit more cost competitive than hiring engineers in the U.S., and then they could make games a little bit cheaper. So they set up the subsidiary and then essentially ran through a bunch of different projects, applying a lot of the best practices for different types of games to all of them. We're trying all sorts of varieties of things from, as I mentioned before, fashion and action sports and stuff like this. But none of those games really took off. And the I guess the management at Linekong, at the parent company, kind of looked at it and said, all right, well, if none of these are really going to make that much money, then we should probably terminate support of this subsidiary because it's just going to be a cost sink, which is what they ended up doing after about a year and a half, 2 years, I think. I only spent a year there, but yeah, I think they kind of saw the writing on the wall that it just wasn't going to work out with this group.
Okay, yeah. So it sounds like that a successful company. It was doing well. They tried to go into something that was new, hot, and different. Didn't quite work out for whatever reason, and they just went back to their core business because, I mean, maybe they could have made it a success if they had, stuck to it for another year or two. But it probably they thought it's too risky to stick with it when we got a profitable business, and there's no point, risking it all on this new studio.
Yeah, I think that's precisely it. I mean, it's such a gamble, and I think um, it's the case where you need a fairly large commitment to user acquisition, and you've always needed it. And I think that's something that maybe they were less comfortable committing to. You need to spend a lot of money, and you need a lot of people to manage it, and that's something that we were good at. I mean, we were managing, but I think just like the total cost, is for a launch is going to be in like the millions, and you can't really be you can't really be super scrappy about it. Like you actually
Hmm.
have to commit there, and I just don't think that they ultimately wanted to do that.
Okay. And how was it? How was working in America at Chartboost and Disney compared to working in Taiwan at Linekong? Like, what was the contrast between the two sort of cultures and the way they did business, and just in general?
Oh, they're super different. Um, so um, Chartboost was very, very like scrappy, small, direct, and and kind of like maybe more flat hierarchy. Disney was friendly and American, but because it was like this massive organization, it's extremely political. So that means that you're like taking sides and you're working on like these like weird executive political things about like who has power and what are they doing and whose project is getting funded and all this sort of silly stuff. Um, in Taiwan, I was managing the team, and I don't speak great Chinese, right? So I was doing everything in English, um, and so I was, in a way, it was like sort of like removed from some of the things that were going on. So if which would occasionally happen, like two coworkers would be upset with each other, but like I wouldn't see it. Like I wouldn't see it because I wouldn't see the way that they're speaking to each other, and I wouldn't like. So I might just like see, maybe people acting a bit strange or avoiding each other, but I couldn't really tell if there was
Nate?
like a problem. Yeah.
Can we just take a quick pause? Your recording seems to be offline. That's strange. So what I'm just gonna do, everyone, I'm just gonna hit stop. I'm gonna check
Hmm.
the recording, and then we'll start a new recording. Obviously, it'll be all stitched together in one. But I'm just gonna hit stop so I can just see what's happened because yours is coming up as offline. You may have recorded it, but just give me a second.
Okay.
Okay, all good, everyone. None of the recording was missed, which is fantastic. It was just a little error on the podcast recording side, said offline, but it's all good. So, Nate, we were just talking about your experience in Taiwan and America, the contrast between it. So, do you want to continue with that?
Sure. Other than interpersonal things, I think there's kind of a fundamental difference in how companies will operate in both regions. American companies are friendly in a certain way, but more adversarial. So you could expect like a certain degree of pushback if you're having an argument with someone, and it may be like in work, and or maybe it's like a sales pitch or something like this. Like there's a certain amount of, you kind of just tell people what you think. I like this, I don't like this. And there's a certain American way where I've noticed like Americans will try to sugarcoat a lot of things. So they will tell you specifically, I don't like this thing. But maybe in like a friendly way. For instance, yeah, this is okay. I'm not so sure if this is the right time for us, but maybe we can look at this another time. Or I think this needs a little bit more work, and then we can consider this project or something like that. But it is a little bit more direct in certain ways. Or you did a really good job, but I just don't think this is for us. Like, kind of that sort of stuff. Um, Whereas in Taiwan, the objective was to be much more harmonious. So you would never criticize somebody in front of other people. Like you would never call somebody out, like, "Hey, did you fuck this thing up?" And I made that mistake. Oops, sorry, I swore. Um, you would never criticize somebody directly in front of their face. So at least not in front of other people. And I had this mistake where I had a one of my team members made a like a really small mistake in setting up a campaign, and I was sitting in a meeting, and I just like with her and with all of my other team members, and I noticed it, and I was like, "Oh, did you clicked the wrong button here. I think we spent a bit too much money." And she went like white as a ghost because she realized that she had made this mistake, and was like, like really kind of like sad and like suddenly very quiet. And I was like, "Oh, okay, well, we'll just fix it and I'll like, deal with it." And later, one of my coworkers like pulled me aside and was like, "Oh, you can't do that. Like you can talk to her like later about this problem, but you can't sit there and like kind of address it right there, because it's humiliating, and you don't want to humiliate people even if you disagree with them and they mess something up." And like that's a difference. Or when somebody pitches you, th- nobody will ever say no in Taiwan, right? They'll never say no, I don't want this. What they'll say is, um, we will consider this more, let's talk about this more. um, or they'll say yes, like, okay, we're ready to go. But it, like, to a sort of a Western ear, it always sounds like yes. You make a pitch, yes. And you're like, oh, great, I can make the sale. But no, actually, you didn't make the sale. They're just like kind of being polite in a way that just kind of continues indefinitely the conversation. And once something changes, then that sort of like nonsense, sort of like silly yes, like BS yes, turns into a real yes, and then it actually happens. Um, so that was different. Um, and beyond that, I think there was like, yeah, there's just like other silly things. Like people are just, they're worried about like offending you. Like, for instance, I used to like turn up the AC really high, right? And I was like, oh well, it's like nobody's complaining, so this, and it's I like it to be pretty cold, so I assume everybody else is fine. And then I would always notice that like the dial on the AC would always like change if I like left the room, and I'm like, oh, it must be broken or something. So I got like a piece of tape, and then I like went over and I like taped the dial so it would stop turning. I thought like the spring in it was off. And then later, I found out that as soon as I would get up and leave the room, my colleagues, or like my team members, would get up and then move the dial so that it wasn't as cold, right? And then I thought I was going crazy because it kept moving. Clearly, it wasn't. And the problem is that there's this culture where you don't want to you don't want to like confront your boss either. You don't want to say like, hey, it's too cold in here. Do you mind if we like turn it up a little bit? Like I wouldn't have minded, but that's not something you do. And so that just sort of like that mindset where it's like, clear relationships between, superior and subordinates and like all that sort of stuff is like it permeates every single thing you do, and every single business interaction. So that's all completely different than the States for sure.
Okay. And what did you learn from Disney, Chartboost, and Linekong in terms of marketing? What would be your, top marketing lessons and tips from those three companies to, let's say, an indie developer, somebody looking to launch their game that doesn't have the marketing clout that someone that that Disney does, but like, what tips would you give to try and make your game successful, or any product for that matter?
Yeah, the key thing that I learned was about data driven marketing and using data in order to justify decisions you're making. I think the old world of marketing is very much centered around just kind of doing like whatever you want, creating like a marketing plan, maybe basing it off of some data that you have from previous plans, but like it's very slow moving. And marketing that worked really well, in sort of like Disney's, even in Disney's era, was stuff that was like extremely reactive. It means changing, the ad units or the creative assets or like, the videos or images that you're using, like changing those frequently, trying to ensure that you're following whatever the latest trends are on those particular things. I think a big thing that we learned is that like honestly like brand matters so little in like mobile marketing and mobile game marketing. There are very few mobile gaming brands that anybody who is not in the industry can name. I mean, most people, if you're like, who is a mobile game developer? Like, if you ask somebody on the street, and you'll hear like maybe Rovio or maybe King, maybe you'll hear a bunch of like the big triple A's. So they'll say like, oh yeah, EA or Activision if they remember them. And beyond that, like nobody knows any single brand. So it doesn't really matter. You don't really need to think about brand. You might think about brand around your game, and so maybe there's like good work around influencers or stuff that you can do. But beyond that, it's like such a dynamic, fast moving, and kind of like frothy industry that stuff and that polish doesn't really matter. Doing big launches doesn't really matter. You can just sort of like slowly release your game as soon as you think there's something to play, and then just begin tuning with real people. There's like there's a relative like infinite supply of players. Because people will come back to your game after a while if you like hit them with the right advertisement. Um, you're never really going to max out on new players, and you can see this with like games like Candy Crush and Clash of Clans have just been going forever, and they're still getting new installs and they're still printing money, so there's a lot of opportunity there. I think that's like a big thing. The other thing is like measure everything and pick certain north stars that you're using to tune to. Make sure that you're tuning to like retention and other simple metrics that you can get a hold of, like retention, ARPU, the average revenue per user, and stuff like that. And then like just keep working on improving those little KPIs, and that's your ticket to success. Yeah, but measure everything. Don't just like throw money in a hole.
Okay. After Linekong, you worked at Seeds. They say they are a payer conversion engine for digital games using social proof. What does that actually mean? And again, what was your role there?
Yeah, so Seeds was has actually changed its uh kind of its like overall mission. Um but while I was there, Seeds was a tool essentially to connect developers with projects for social good. So I was an advisor for Seeds for a long time. I knew the founder quite well. And I wanted to help her out in this project. So basically, I went over for a little bit to kind of connect her to a bunch of developers who might be interested. And what the tool would allow people to do is to implement a really small SDK in their game or app. Um, and the SDK would help them promote a very specific in-app purchase. So it'd be something a uh, like a coin pack or something, and players could then click on that ad that Seeds would help serve. So Seeds would serve up an ad for the coin pack, see how many people made a purchase of that particular IAP of that coin pack, and then it would take a percentage of that revenue and would not donate it to charity, but it would um, lend it to entrepreneurs in the developing world. So the idea there was we're not doing charity because charity is sort of like one, it kind of moves in one direction, but we can help people help themselves by going to like entrepreneurs. And specifically, we were working with women in Kenya. And we can give them a bit of money, and it's like small amounts, small loans of like a couple $100 that they can use to improve their businesses, which then they turn around and they pay back really quickly. And then, you know, Seeds would make that money back plus a little bit of interest. And then at the same time, be helping people kind of build their businesses. So I helped with the connecting to developers part. Seeds has since changed its business model and become a little bit more like a kind of like a cryptocurrency for like I guess a little bit more like a cryptocurrency for charity, where you get specific tokens and then you can buy them or redeem them, and they help to they basically help people in need, sort of like GoFundMe. Um, with whatever it is that they specifically, you know, whatever projects they need help with. I left Seeds around the time that it was making the transition from kind of like a gaming social good as a service to a more of like a crypto focus. Um, uh, so I kind of like, you know, pieced out around that point. Since the crypto side of like GoFundMe, I think I found less interesting than working in games.
Okay. And in 2017, you co-founded the company, the Ultra Bright. What did that company do?
The Ultra Bright was a project I started with my wife, where we kind of had a website, and then we did like it was like a passion project where yeah, we just like a website where we did like fashion blog posts and stuff like that. I think that was more of an excuse for her and I to like hang out and take pictures than like a real business. But it's up there.
Okay. And I mean, this question probably doesn't matter as much anymore, but you said according to your LinkedIn, you left the Ultra Boy after a year. Did you just shut it down, or did she just take it over permanently and take it to a different direction?
Oh, no, we kind of like kept it around for a while. We'll still take pictures. I think we just sort of realized that like it like so basically the genesis behind this is that I had a former coworker who's him and his wife are like very successful fashion influencers. And so I really at that time was it just like I kind of needed like a break from tech, and I was like, okay, I want to do something that is just like very much a hands-on sort of like artistic pursuit. And so we started doing that. We're like, okay, well, maybe we can get this to be big enough to be like influencers or something, but let's just have fun. Let's find our artistic vision and get used to like, you know, making content and stuff like that. Um, um, and so we kind of just started working on that. She ended up getting a job as a programmer, and I went to go work at Kolibri. in Germany. So I think there's some content that's still around. I don't think the website is. Maybe it is. But the um, uh, bulk of it, like we just sort of, moved on. We still take pictures. We still do a lot of that stuff. We just don't really like publish them to our website and like write blog posts about, why various scarves are better than other scarves. Like that part we're not really doing so much anymore. But the fun photo part we still do.
Okay. Do you use some other platform like Instagram instead to share the content, or is it purely private?
Oh yeah, it's mostly on her Instagram. So you can follow her. Her name is Waco Tsai. Let me make sure I get her Instagram right. If people are listening and want to follow her, um,
I'll get all the relevant links off Nate for this and anything else, and I'll put it in the description so nobody will have an issue accessing it. But yeah, feel free to check if you're getting it right.
yeah, absolutely. And if you do want to find it, it is WEKOTSAI. So you can find her right there on Instagram. With mostly all the photos that I take, some that other folks have taken of her. Um, and then yeah, it was like a really fun experience. It was really fun to write the content and take the photos and like figure out how fashion photography works. I got really into like Lightroom at the time and stuff like that. So overall, like I would highly recommend taking a little time off to pursue something artistic or creative or just like fulfilling. It's a good way to reset your mind and your spirit.
I think you kind of alluded to it, previously a couple of questions ago. Who made the Ultra Bright website? Was it your wife? Because you said she went off to become a programmer.
She worked on it a bit. I think we were using mostly a Squarespace plugin for that at the time. But she worked on it enough to the point where she realized that she enjoyed engineering. And so she then went to, when we moved to Berlin after that, she went to a coding school where she picked up a little bit more hard technical skills and learned how to become a JavaScript programmer. So while she didn't make our website, she did end up learning how to make those types of websites now, which is super cool, and I think super courageous to go and make a career change like that.
Oh yeah, for sure. That sort of coding class thing that you were saying, was that one of those sort of crash courses that you see like with 1, 2, 3 weeks, or was it something else?
Yeah, it was. So it was a coding crash course. I think it was pretty long. It was a couple months, maybe 4 months or so.
Okay.
Um, so when we were looking for coding classes, we found we kind of had like our guiding principle was it needs to be JavaScript, which basically all of them were. It needs to be as long as possible, with the rationale being that would give the most exposure and the most like teach the most. Um, and it needed one of the cool things that the one she went to had, which was a company called Ubicom, which I don't think is still in business, but the brand might be still out there and being reused for something else. So if you look it up, you can see that's Ubiquum, Ubicom, which I think is like a pun on like you will become something. Um, that one had a discount for women in order to kind of like encourage more to get into the industry, which was cool because from like a price standpoint, it was a better deal, and B, it meant that there was going to be a supportive environment for women who code, which is super cool. So that's where she ended up going, and then she studied there for a while. She got certified, and then was able to transition to be a front end developer for a company that did like health services online. Essentially, like the company was for people who wanted to do medical tourism. So if they want to travel to like Turkey to get like hair plugs or something, this was like a platform that enabled people to do that. Um, she left when COVID started, and unfortunately, that was a really bad time to be in either anything that is like tourism related or anything that is like medical related for elective medical procedures. It just was not a good time for either of those things, and to be doing both of those things simultaneously was not so hot. So she later went on to work at a company called Data for Life, which is where she did a lot more work on like COVID dashboards and things like that, which is super cool.
Okay. And after she did that coding course, how did she find it going into or getting her first role? Do you think she found it harder than if she had gone to university, got a, computer science or some sort of engineering degree, and obviously I'm not asking for specifics. Do you think the salary reflected that, or was it similar to as if she had done university and she was going in as a junior?
Um, in Germany, which is where we're living at that point in the story, I think it was harder. I think in Germany specifically, they tend to really favor folks who have like university degrees.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think the salary necessarily was any lower, but she did need to apply to a literally, I think it was like 100 um uh like companies
So
before
a lot
she
then.
got, yeah, it was, and she kept a spreadsheet of like all 100. So I know it was the 101st was this company that she ended up working for. I know other people who did coding schools in the Bay Area, and they were, there's like so much more tech money like floating around the Bay that it was much easier to get a job for people out there. And they moved much quicker, and they ended up with like super high, Bay Area engineering salaries. I think to some degree that's cooled off a bit, and it's no longer as um, it's no longer as much of like a buyer's market. I'm sorry, a seller's market, if you will, when it comes to being a recent grad in the Bay Area tech world. It's a bit harder. I think people want to see a little bit more on like professional schooling than there used to be.
Okay. And when she switched companies, did she find it easier because she had obviously got a company on her CV and some sort of portfolio now, or was it still a bit of an upward struggle?
It was a bit of an upward struggle, and I think a lot of that was just because of like the timing, being that it was like, you know, early 2020 in the middle of the pandemic, and suddenly there were just like a ton of people who were laid off, specifically from all sorts of tech jobs that maybe had more of a focus on like things that could no longer be done anymore in the new normal. So right, like if you were running a travel service or an event service or a whatever, like suddenly all these people just like didn't have jobs anymore, and so they were all kind of floating. um, she was a bit lucky though, because the founder of the company that she had previously been working for um, knew the management team at the company she ended up working for. So her former boss, essentially her former CEO, made a really nice introduction, and kind of helped to smooth that transition over. She still had to go, of course, through all of like the interview process and everything like that, but it ended up being a little bit smoother. I wonder now if she was applying, what it would be like, since a lot of this COVID stuff is, although apparently it's still floating around, is like no longer impacting businesses the same way. Um, but yeah, it'd be an interesting to see how it is for people trying to get hired these days.
Okay. And did she have a technical background, prior to this? Because I hear a lot of, people saying all the time they want to become a programmer, they want to get into like a technical field like that. And most of the time they don't have a technical background and that puts them off. I've seen people do it. They are rare. So I'm just wondering, did she have a technical background or was it literally a 180 from what she was doing before?
It was a 180. Yeah. So she used to be a singer-songwriter under contract in Taiwan. Um, and she like worked for a music production facility. Um, this like recording company out there. And so this was vastly different from that. And prior to that, she went to university at the University of Edinburgh for fashion. And this was also very much not fashion, so it was pretty different. Before she embarked on like the coding school, she did like 2 months of a website called Codecademy, which helped introduce her to JavaScript so that she knew that what to expect and if she would like it or not.
Okay, yeah, Codecademy is a website that I recommend to a lot of people that aren't coders and that are looking to get into it. How did she find that? Going into it from nothing.
I think it was good as an introduction. I think the challenge for her was that she wanted more like hands-on guidance, which is something that you
Mm.
don't get from Codecademy. But I think in the early stages, when you're first just like learning, what an if statement is, and how to print hello world, and how to deal with variables and all this kind of stuff, like it is a pretty useful introduction, so that when she jumped into her like the developer bootcamp at Ubicom, she already knew a lot of what to expect. That boot camp had people who either like had deep technical backgrounds that were just like looking for how to do things in JavaScript, all the way to people who were had never touched a command line before. So she was kind of somewhere maybe in the middle of her experience. But it was a really good way to know, first and foremost, like, is this something you like doing? Like, if you like sitting in one in a cafe for 8 hours at a time, like plugging away on like a black screen, yeah, this is for you. If you get really tired of that after about 2 hours and want to do something else, then this is a cheaper way to find out than like going to university or like doing one of these crash courses, right?
And quicker as well. Because that's the other
Much
thing.
quicker.
Because obviously, cost is one thing, but maybe 100 grand, whether your cost to go uni in whatever country you are, maybe that's not a lot of money for you and your family. But then you still got the time aspect. You don't want to spend 3-4 years at the because I know people like that went to university with me, and then at the end, I mean, they got the degree, they got a degree in programming, and then they didn't do anything with it. It just didn't excite them enough. So yeah, there's that as well, like the time aspect. Finding out within 2 to 4 months or so, is definitely a lot better than spending multiple years as well.
Exactly. Yeah, I think all of those things are true, and all of those things helped to make this decision. Which was great that these things are like out there and they're free and you can just like try it out, and they're also pretty fun. Like, I'm not much of a programmer, but I tried out the Codecademy thing for a little bit, and had a fun time of it. It's like pretty fulfilling tool to use.
Yeah, with Codecademy, I don't know how it is now, but I remember trying it probably in the first couple or so years of when it launched, and I found that if you wasn't a coder, which I was, it was pretty difficult because you would get a set of instructions, you would do the instructions, or you would get like a goal that you need to achieve. You write the code, it technically would work. And I know it would work because, like I was saying, I was a coder and I knew that code should work and I tested it outside of the Codecademy environment. And but it wouldn't work on their environment because they needed it, they wanted it formatted in the set exact way that they was looking for. I'm hoping that's still not the case anymore, but that aspect of it for a beginner, I think, could have been a bit daunting. I feel like they probably have fixed it by now because that was many years ago. Did she or did you, when you used it, come across any issues like that? That you just felt
I
like what you wrote just should work, but it just didn't?
I think it still works like that to some degree. I think that's still one of the problems and one of the reasons that after a certain point, you sort of like hit your limit with what you can do in Code Academy, because they're teaching you to do things a certain way, just as you say, that aren't necessarily the way that you have to do it. And I
Mm.
think what you soon discover when you're like learning a program is that there's, 100 different ways to accomplish the same thing. And there's different, nuances in why you would pick one way over the other. And there's different, positives and negatives, but like the sort of like Codecademy terminal can't really express that to you very, very well. I used another system too because I was learning Python, and what I found is that like after a certain point, like you stop getting valuable feedback from the system, and you essentially like you could be self-directed and do your own stuff, but that's great for autodidacts. But like if you want, to learn why something is better than the others, or if you even did things right, like the online learning tools that are like automated, like they only are so useful for so long. Um, Before you need like another human being to intervene and actually like show you what to do. Like I've had this experience with like trying to learn a language on Duolingo to like I took like a product management course that was probably the worst online course I've ever taken was the product management course. And it was just
What
like
did they cover? Like, what was their highlights?
it was designed to teach people how to be product managers specifically for apps and games. And it was really like poorly like there were some things where like there's like basic instruction, here's what a KPI is and here's how you like use the software, and it was using something called Amplitude, which is like a pretty common analytics software. And you're like learning how to do things and you're learning to avoid some basic mistakes like if somebody was teaching you how to use Amplitude. But then it started getting into a point where like they would ask you something like, oh, you notice that there's some weird data on these days. Why is there weird data on those days? And you're like, okay, so you look at it and you play around a little bit and you're like, I don't know, maybe there was like a release of the app and it broke or something, and then it would say like, nope, you're wrong, the answer is because there's like a holiday in that particular state in the country that the app was released. I'm like, this is not useful. Like, this is so like esoteric and random that like the first time, okay, it's kind of funny. Like, okay, that's interesting. I'll try and keep that in mind. But then, like every single assignment they would give you would end with some like weird gotcha, like that. And the assignments were like, here, write like 10 paragraphs on this question about like what this fictional company should do with their analytics data, and like how they have this app and look at the data and tell us how this company should act if you're the product manager. But then there was never any feedback on whether or not you were right. It would just say like, okay, thanks for your submission, and then it would move on to the next question. You're like, wait a second, I just spent like an hour writing this whole thing and you're not even going to tell me if like I was right or wrong. Like, I think they did so many things wrong. It was for me pretty annoying. And in that case, my company paid for it, but it was like $1,000 like online class, which is far more than many online classes are. And I think it was just like a complete waste of time. And like I knew people who were like advisors to that company, and I explained to them, I'm like, this is probably one of the worst things I've ever used. I don't like to like get up, and I won't name them because I'll be nice, but like it was pretty appalling. So I guess you have to be super careful about like the types of these things you do, and like which classes you end up enrolling in.
Yeah, for sure. Do you think that the company that put you on the course was literally just ticking a box? Like, Nate's gone on, some sort of project management course, tick, done. Or did you think they genuinely, thought that it would help?
Oh well, so the company that paid for the course is so I worked at Ubisoft, right? So they paid for it, and when I was there, I um I have a close friend who worked in like the finance department, and he was going through this whole like journey where he was learning how to program, and then he was learning like product management. And he was trying to figure out what he wanted to do because he didn't want to do finance, and so he recommended this course to me, which is why I did it. And he loved it. He thought it was like a great course, and they were like really clever, and he like learned so much, and he thought it was like really really brilliant. And so I took that and I was like, okay, this is highly recommended. So I went to my uh, like there was a learning and development team at Ubisoft, if it still is, um, and their job was to give people funds to take courses or give them books or other learning materials, which is a super good idea. Um, and they had all of that, and then they paid for it, but like they were like, "Are you sure you want to do this? Because like this is really expensive." I'm like, "Oh well, it comes super recommended." They're like, "Okay," and then I followed up with them later, and they're like, "So what do you think of the course?" And I was like, "Don't let anybody spend money on that. This is definitely not worth it." So I guess in a way, yeah, it was their job to check the box and make sure that I like did my learning and development. Um, yeah.
So before we move on to your next roles, you've been mainly doing roles in games companies. Why the gaming industry compared to some other media related industry or even the news industry?
Um, I just resonate more, I think, with entertainment. I went to film school, and I really like working on things that entertain people. When I was in high school, I did a lot of like theater and acting, and I found that really fulfilling. And in university, I thought the next logical step would be film, because it's a medium that you can use to entertain a lot of people all over the world. And I think I liked games. I kind of like got into games because I first needed a job, right? When I went to work at Disney. I just come out of school and it was like a cool opening, and I knew people who worked there. Um, but what I came to fall in love with was with games, other than the fact that I play games avidly, is that games allow you to make incremental improvements to an entertainment product, which is not something that you can easily do with basically any other medium. You can't really have a movie where every week you're like iterating and adding a new scene or removing a scene. Like once you make a movie, it's essentially done. And there are directors, of course, who will release their director's cut, a year, 2 years later, blah blah blah. But like the vast majority of people, in film and TV, like they can't really have that luxury of slowly making something better. So I like that about games. I like that it was based on data and also based on intuition. Um, and it was emerging. There's like a huge industry, and it's just like exploding in terms of industry growth, and every year it's just increasing in size, which means it's a good time to get in, learn the ropes, and then just kind of like stick with it. The people who work in games are also like super, super nice and fun and humble and just great to be around. So, I'm surrounded by a bunch of people that are like minded in a lot of ways, which makes it even better.
Yeah, I feel like again, you let me know your opinion on it. I feel like the people in the gaming industry are more humble than the ones in, let's say, film industry, partly because gaming is kind of still in some people's eyes seen as a joke or as like a kids thing, even though it dwarfs the movie industry, it dwarfs the music industry and the film industry combined. It dwarfs them, but it's still considered like a plaything, almost like not as serious. Do you think that might be part of why the people there are more humble compared to in movies? It's like, oh, I'm in movies, I'm on this big, movie, compared to the people I spoke to that I work at big games companies and on big, AAA titles. You're right, they are a lot more grounded. Obviously, it depends on the individual, but as a whole, than people in movies where it's like, oh yeah, I'm this so and so coordinator on this movie.
Yeah, and I think it's that for sure. The fact that it's originally more associated with kids. I think some of the other factors that you were kind of alluding to are like there aren't many like how do I put this? There aren't many like famous, sexy game developers,
Mm.
right? Like it's something where people who make the games are kind of hidden behind their computer screens and like off in offices. and they're not, out on like, there's not like a bunch of, like with a movie, you have tons of press, and then there's big events, and then there's the actors who are real human beings, and people can like relate to them. So they get trotted out to go to the award shows and to go to the premieres, and you're watching them the entire time. But in a game, like, there are characters a lot often, and those characters are reasonably famous. People can recognize Mario or Link, um, but those are their digital creations, right? So it's not like that's a real human being who like grew up, in some place, and is has a backstory and a family and ages and has drama behind the scenes and like, whatever. Um, with a game that doesn't exist. It like was created by people, and the people who are creating it are changing constantly. So like the people who work at Nintendo 30 years ago don't really work at Nintendo anymore, except for a few. And some of those like game designers are famous among people, but like the most played games of all time, like uh, nobody could tell me like who designed Candy Crush. Like, who are the game designers? Like, right? Like, that's one of the biggest games of all time, but in terms of sheer number of players out there. But nobody's, that those people aren't famous. They're not, walking down the red carpet or whatever. So I think that's like, it's just a matter of like visibility of like the people who are working on it. That's a big part of it. And I think that's a lot of why like it hasn't quite gone to the heads of a lot of the people in games. Don't get me wrong, there are some folks like in every industry that you will meet that are, maybe less pleasant to be around in video games, and those people exist, and there's definitely some egos. Um, and but I think it's less of a it's because it's less visible. You don't get that as much. And really, to your point, like, because it's seen as such like a kids thing, that it's not, people's egos don't get as inflated, which you could then contrast with, say, like fashion, where in fashion, yeah, there's the people who are behind the scenes, who are the designers and running the fashion houses, are also less visible to some degree, although they go to the fashion shows. But fashion is taken so seriously and has been taken so seriously for so long that those people can, get famous, and maybe that's where some of the working conditions there, sprout out of, because people's like, people's egos can inflate a bit, and so you'll get like a devil wears Prada situation, right? Where like you're at the top of the food chain, and then it is just swimming with ego. Games are more humble, not as humble as like, I don't know, if you work in like the forestry industry, or if you're like make bitumen all day, like, yeah, those people are probably quite humble, because they don't have that kind of fame. But it's somewhere in between.
Yeah, I think it kind of comes down to if you're around some random people or at the dinner table, or at a dinner function. If your job and your title excites more people, I feel like they're the less humble ones. It's like you could get a fashion designer that's, let's say, making 100 grand a year, but they're designing clothes that a lot of rich people, a lot of influential people want to wear, and they like them. But likewise, you could get somebody on the table that's a 22-year-old, out of university. He's made some mobile hit and he's making like a million a month. And I feel like the fashion designer for the long term will probably get more attention than the game creator. I feel like the game creator might get ooh, that's cool and interesting. That's your little hobby thing. But even then, even when the money is serious, it won't be as interesting. And I feel like that, inflates their egos, because, the people around there, the powerful people, the rich people, are, effectively, throwing fuel on the flame. They're the ones, inflating it.
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of it for sure. Yeah, games kind of has a long way to go there. Some people really like them. Like, obviously kids get excited when they find out you work in games.
Mm.
And it was funny too, because in San Francisco, if you told people you work in games, like people would be like, meh. Like they know so many other people who work in
Yeah,
games. It's like exciting, and so you're like, okay, I guess I'm not that cool. And but out here in Germany, where I am now, it's like a little bit more of like a, it's a little bit cooler, I think.
yeah.
But you have to like kind of test the waters a little bit because some people just hate games. Like I definitely
Mm.
told one person that I made games, but this was in Chicago. And he was like a music teacher, and he was like angry at me. He's like, "Oh, it's your fault that none of my students practice their instruments anymore." I was like, "Okay, sorry. Uh, I don't know how to fix that, but I hope they're playing some cool games then."
Yeah. You never know, they might go on to making music for games. I think that will probably, annoy him even more.
Oh, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And that's a great industry too, music for games. You need them.
Oh yeah, for sure. And again, I think that's another one that doesn't get that much attention or love as well, and respect. Because I remember a few years ago there was a concert in London. I didn't attend it at the time, but they played a bunch of classic video game music. They had Mario, they had Mass Effect, Call of Duty, GTA, all that sort of stuff. So it's the London Philharmonic video game orchestra. You can get it on Spotify, so I can check out what they're playing. But I remember talking about it, and people that weren't really heavily into gaming, they just saw it as a joke, and they were just thinking, why would you want to go there to listen to that? And it's accepted enough that you might go to a concert to listen to film music, and it's definitely accepted that you'll go to a concert to listen to somebody singing or a band playing. But yeah, there's still that stigma, and I think it just links back to just because it's gaming.
Oh, for sure, for
Yeah.
sure. I think it's something that it'll take some time, but a game did win a Grammy not too long ago, so I think it's possible we'll see more and more of that as time goes on and as the younger generation sort of like grow into their political and cultural power.
Yeah, I'm just hoping that it doesn't, these awards and mainstream sort of success metrics don't get to the head of the people that are in charge, or the up and coming designers and creators, because that sort of lack of attention, lack of kind of respect has kept them humble, but also kept them creating great content. The problem you see with, I mean, it's a problem in games, but it's definitely a problem in music and in movies. Is there's just so much rinse and repeat, and there's just so much just pandering to politics, and just putting this person or this storyline in there and tweaking it just so it's better for the political ecosystem. Whereas in games, there's not that much of that. When you do get a little bit of it, there's a huge uproar because that's not what's typically done in games. So I'm hoping that, because at the end of the day, the gaming industry is doing fine financially. They're bigger than movies, they're bigger than music combined. So it's not like they need those traditional success metrics to actually have success. So I'm just hoping they can stay grounded and keep creating great content that is what they want to create and not what they feel like the political ecosystem dictates to them.
I think a lot of times the reason that people will kind of like do things that are maybe more politically palatable or like of the zeitgeist, right? Uh, Tend to be kind of like laziness. It feels like so. I watch a lot of like, or with my wife, we watch a lot of Netflix, and you'll see there's definitely like a recycling of a lot of the same stories and like a lot of the same character tropes and stereotypes and while I think it's like a good thing to have like a diversity of like characters and experience represented, like of course like that's a great thing, but I think where a lot of these storytellers fail is they're like, okay, well, this person of this background, their story is ABC and it's always going to be ABC, Like, either they're gonna have like these troubles or these types of relationships, or they're gonna have these types of troubles with this relationship, and it's just like it's so rote. It's like the same thing over and over and over again, and then it just becomes the center of the storyline. And I think that what's frustrating about that sort of thing is that it tends to be really it's just like lazy. It's like you can't tell any other stories about, say like the person is from I will just pick something. Let's say we're setting a TV show right in like Mexico or something. So there's a lot of things that are like really interesting and cool and fascinating about Mexico. We don't need to see another story set in Mexico necessarily that is like about a like say a drug cartel. Like there's just infinitely more interesting things that we can talk about in Mexico, and you'll see with like particularly with filmmakers and on TV that I think the sheer amount of content that comes out, you end up with just like really really lazy writing that leads you into those types of depictions of human experiences when there's a lot more that goes on um, in every aspect of humanity. So in games, you do see a degree of that. You'll see, okay, let's depict gangs this way, or let's make things about gangs. And that's the only way that the story can exist is, if we have like gang members and they all look like this and they all talk like this and they all do these types of things. And like, yeah, I guess if you're GTA, you can have that because that's like been your mainstay, and there's like a few games similar to that that they've kind of got around. But like Saints Row and stuff like this. But like there are other tales. There's other narratives. There's other game designs and mechanics that we can work around where we don't have to like be so like lazy. And that's just kind of like, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because like sometimes these types of like cultural things are very um they're shortcuts, and those can be useful. So say I want to make a movie about, drug cartels, and I'm going to go to, Colombia or Mexico, and you'll instantly understand like what this thing is. Like what's, who are these people with guns with all of this like these white packages like on the table? Oh, I know where I understand this is a drug cartel. Great. But like we talk about this like especially in our studio like with the types of games that we're trying to make. It's like let's make them more, let's try and challenge some of those stereotypes and some of those norms and try and like make things that are a little bit more interesting. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Like for instance, like if you want to have, a fantasy game, like fantasy games, like think about every fantasy game you play or think about every fantasy movie you see, and almost every time like elves represent something, and there's always trolls are always bad guys and goblins are bad guys, and elves are like the superior smart species, and orcs and ogres are the bad ones, and humans are in between, and dwarves are basically like Scottish gold miners, and it's like the same thing over and over. If I were to come in and tell you, okay, the elves are like dumb and evil, and the dwarves are like, mystical and hyper intelligent, or maybe just mystical, and the goblins or the ogres or the trolls are like hyper intelligent, and the good guys, like you would come into that and you'd be like super confused, like, what the hell is going on? Why is everything upside down here? Why do I have to really learn how everything works? And like, yeah, so maybe you don't want to spend all the time teaching everybody like all new set of reality and a new paradigm that they need to adhere to. But then again, like you're torn between that and then just playing the same stupid game with the same characters that's copy paste from something else. So I guess like the real lesson there is like at least for my personal experiences, like don't be lazy, like try and challenge the norms, and do that in every in every artistic medium.
Okay. So moving on, you worked 5 years at Kolibri Games. What did you do there?
um at Kolibri, I worked on a bunch of different things. It was really cool. I worked on ad monetization since I had the background from Chartboost, and I could help Kolibri generate a lot more ad revenue, which is my first task was like get new networks, optimize the networks, work out a few good deals with the various ad platforms, um, and try and monitor and optimize that over time. Come up with a system, which I did. Um, then I also worked on like kind of an assortment of various like procurements. So if we're gonna work on a new contract with a new platform, um, an analytics platform, let's make sure we have a good contract in place and we're not paying too much money and we have good opt outs. If we're going to look at IP, if we want, our game to appear in a Netflix show, which is something I worked on, how does that work, and how do we get that through, um, uh, and make a process around that. So I worked on like all sorts of random things. We looked at publishing for a while. We looked at acquiring a studio for a while. Like kind of like did a bunch of different things. The main objective was um, keep the lights on. So stay focused on things that'll generate revenue, and then get out there and tell Kolibri's story. I think Kolibri knew very early on that they wanted to sell their company, and so my objective was to make sure that Kolibri looked as good as possible to all of the potential people that would be acquiring the company. So I spent a lot of time at trade shows, talking to some of like the bigger uh, publishers and other companies that might potentially uh, buy Kolibri. Ultimately, we were bought by Ubisoft, which kind of came out of nowhere, but had been looking to develop their strategy around mobile, and so Kolibri fit quite nicely into the types of acquisitions that they wanted to do around that strategy.
Okay, and how long was you there for when it got bought out by Ubisoft?
Well, I joined. Let's see. I think I had been there for about 2 years. Let me think. Yeah, I was there for about 2.5 years before they were acquired, and then I stuck around for another 2 years after the acquisition had happened. Um, before starting my own studio.
Okay, and how was it like working there once Ubisoft bought them out? Was there any difference at all?
Initially, there wasn't much of a difference, and um, the founders of Kolibri were still at Kolibri, so the founders and the executive team were all there, so they kind of like kept a tight rein on things, and so you didn't see a lot of like influence from Ubisoft. Most of the influence was just in like, let's make sure all of the contracts are like with Ubisoft, and let's make sure all of the like various like financial reporting is all done the Ubisoft way, because Ubisoft is a public company, and it has to be done that way. I think over time, as like the founders left, and then as the more like Ubisoft kind of like began to exert more and more and more influence, and some of this was like super good. I mean, like Ubisoft opened the door to do a lot of like IP integrations with like Assassin's Creed and Just Dance and stuff like that, which was super cool. And some of it was like behind the scenes, okay, let's make sure that we're all working together on marketing and stuff like that. Over time, that became more and more and more. But ultimately, Ubisoft Mobile, at least, has a very like laissez-faire approach to a lot of their studios. So as long as you are doing a good job and you are generating revenue for the company, nobody's really going to come in and tell you what to do. Like they don't actually like to get too controlling um, uh, when it comes to their approach. They'll try, like they're very helpful. Like you'll meet everybody at Ubisoft, which is cool. And there's a lot of cool events, and there's a lot of people who want to help you with various things. But um, help make sure you have access to all the data you need, or all of the files you want, or that you're on the IT side you're all set up and squared away, or that you can talk to anybody you want to talk to. Like, they will everybody there is immensely helpful if you want to be helped. If you want to not be helped, then you can retreat, and nobody's really gonna harass you too much.
Okay, and since March of this year, you have been an advisor for Flagship Games Group. You see people, being advisors to companies like this all the time. They have this on their, bio. What does that actually mean?
Sure. In this case, so the guy the CFO of Kolibri, who helped to sell the company to Ubisoft, went and started a company afterwards. And Flagship's objective is to acquire other smaller gaming studios, package them together, and then list on a stock exchange. Um, as sort of like a new publisher, right? So they're kind of like a publishing startup, similar to Stillfront or Embracer Group. So, as an advisor, my role is actually very specific. So I have all of this business development experience from when I was at Chartboost, and from when I was at Seeds, and from Kolibri, of course. And so I help them if there is somebody specifically that they want to talk to, and they know that either I am directly connected to them, or I'm like, one or two people away from them. So it's quite easy for me to get an introduction. I'll help them out very specifically with that task. So it's not something that takes a tremendous amount of my time, um, but is helpful in them at kind of advancing um, their sales pipeline to acquire new studios. So it's been a great experience because I can then talk to the founder of that company, who, as we'll get to probably in a second, since I founded my own game studio, he advises me in return on, okay, if you want your company to sell eventually, or if you just want to, like, if you want to go public, or if you want to do anything, this is how you run a tight ship when it comes to finances and legal and accounting for your own studio. This is like follow these steps, and don't do anything too wacky on the finance and legal side, and you will be in ship shape when it comes to whatever whatever those objectives are.
Okay. And now, finally, to get on to the pod that I've been really looking forward to talk about, Roma Games, the company you founded in, I believe, February of this year. What is the goal of Roma Games? What does it do?
Sure. So in February, I left Kolibri, and then with a few folks launched Romer Games. These were people that I knew from when I was at mostly at Kolibri, and so we had team members joining from Kolibri, from Wargaming, and from AppLovin. And we got together, and we wanted to make games that are um, basically like new genre defining games. So we raised a good amount of money from our friends at Play Ventures, and we launched a game that was kind of like an experimental, sort of like 2D Animal Crossing kind of game. Animal Crossing meets The Sims. And then pivoted a bit away from that, and are now focusing on a Forex strategy game. So a game very similar to like a Civilization on PC, or a Polytopia on mobile, and we're making a game that's like that, but is much more focused, and much more like kind of a quicker sessions. And what we're trying to do is to kind of like revolutionize that genre. It's a genre that has been sort of like very stale for a very long time. There hasn't been that much innovation in the Forex genre. Mostly what you'll see when it's a mobile game studio, right? So mostly when you see people doing mobile game studio or mobile game Forexes, they tend to be very much like menu after menu after menu, and like very like it's like a spreadsheet with an interface and a buy now button. and they're actually not super interesting games for the majority of the world. A very very specific audience is into those um, types of 4X games, and we're not a big fan of those types of 4X games. We want to make 4X games that are more accessible to kind of like casual strategy players, similar to a game, to what Clash Royale and Clash of Clans have done for strategy, right? Like those games are strategy, but it's very easy to get into and very easy to understand. And there's deep strategy to them, and they monetize pretty well. But they're more democratizing in their approach than some of these like super hardcore strategy games. So we kind of want to do this in the 4X genre. If you're not familiar with the 4X genre, it is in in the traditional PC world. Um, it's usually like a turn-based strategy game. Sometimes it's a real-time strategy game. Um, and they're games that like have been around since, I don't know, the beginning of most PC games. And the 4X's actually stand for explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. So usually these are games that are like kind of PvP or PvE, like a computer player. And the basic tenets of it are, you start off on a map. It's usually like a dark map, but there's a fog of war. You don't know what's around you, so you need to explore. Usually start off with a small base or a small city, and you need to expand that. So maybe at the very beginning you can't do a whole lot. Maybe you have like a farm, or maybe you have like a very limited capability. Maybe just like a little production facility or something. So you need to grow your base. You need to get more farms and start cutting down trees or start building barracks to train troops and do all that sort of stuff. You need to come across resources usually. So if there's trees, you got to cut them down, or if there's minerals, you have to mine them. Okay, and then exterminate. Right. So you're going to come up against your opponents, and you need to have the superior. Usually, it's a superior army. Sometimes there's other things like culture or economy or something, or religion. But usually you have a superior army, and you need to exterminate your opponents. And it's sort of like um, they range in size from small strategy games like the one we're making on mobile up to what are called grand strategy games, like games like Stellaris or Civilization or stuff like that, that are just like these big epic experiences. So we're trying to make something along those lines, but a bit more for mobile and a bit more friendly for monetizing.
Okay, so you've raised money for Roma Games from VCs. What was that process like?
It was different than I thought it would be. So we went through this process where we identified um, a bunch of um, VCs that we thought would be good to connect with, and then we kind of ranked them all from A to C. And so we started at C, and we began like a lot of the C level ones were interesting investors, but we thought that maybe they wouldn't be so interested in us, and they would, or like they were friends and they would take like a courtesy call, but basically they would tell us what was wrong with our pitch, so we could kind of get a little bit of practice. And if they wanted to invest, sure, that's great, in most cases, but we knew that they probably wouldn't be so interested. And we did that, and we started working our way up the C category, then getting ready to go to the B category. But somebody who was on, actually several people on the C list were like, "Hey, so this isn't right for us, but I know this one person." And that one person was the top of our A list. And before we could, like, if somebody says that to you, you don't say, "Don't introduce me." You say, "Yes, please introduce me." And so then they introduced us to that person, and that person didn't really even look at our pitch. Like they listened to it, to be curious, and they read the deck, but they were basically like, "Okay, we're in. We'll put in money, and we just want to meet the rest of your team, and then we're going to be ready to go." So that happened extremely fast. That was like a 20-minute call, and they're like, "Okay, we'll put in either all of the million or a million and 1.15, all of the money, or we can do a part of it, but we want to be the lead investor here." And we were like, "Okay." wow, that was super fast and super cool. That was cool. Um, then after that, I mean, it was like a because of COVID, it was a bit things moved a bit slower in general. But then we went through the process of getting the legal stuff out of the way, and then we just kind of incorporated our company, and that was like its own sort of thing.
Okay. And so when the lead investor or the investor that became the lead investor, when they said, well, either invest all of it or like the biggest chunk of it, was they basically giving you that decision, or was that basically them saying, once we've decided where we stand, we'll decide?
Um, they gave us the decision,
Okay.
so they wanted to invest all of it, but strategically, I wanted to work with um, a few more investors because my rationale was this will open us up to more investors further down the line. So the more investors further down the line, and B, it will provide more guidance. So one big thing when it comes to investors and VCs is like it's actually not just a one-way street. It's not just you getting like pitching to them and then you're grateful to have any money you can. You want to pick investors who are going to be providing value beyond just the cash, but actually like teaching you or providing advice or guidance. So we wanted to work with Play Ventures, who's the one we ended up working with, because these were folks that had run their own game studios, sold their own game studio, and were extremely well connected to all of the like major game developers, publishers, and they could give us advice like, hey, like this is what's wrong with your product, or this is what's wrong with your marketing. And a few of the other studios that we chose to work with, or the other investors we chose to work with, also had that advantage. So we could get a little bit more bang for our buck there. If we're going to be selling, 20% of our company, then I want to make sure that we're maximizing what we're getting for that 20%. So we got Play Ventures who put in the bulk of the cash. The former founders, the people I used to work for at Kolibri, also did put in some money, which is great. Then we also had an advisor who put in some cash as well, which is nice. And he runs his own game studio. And we had something called a syndicate, if people aren't familiar with it. That's usually like a group of people that all go together to like make an investment. And the reason you want to do it with a syndicate is that usually you have a bunch of people who don't have $50 or $100,000 to make an investment. Maybe they have $5,000, but nobody wants to get 50 people with $5,000 on their cap table. So instead, they do a syndicate, which is okay. It's all going under one person's name, and that person's like the executive of that like little mini investment company. And then you get, of course, after that, access to all of those people. So and those were all people in the industry, like friends, um, uh, 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 old friends, new friends, who had experience and knew what they were doing. So you can then go and talk to them and be like, hey, you're an investor in my studio. Can you tell me how you're doing marketing? Can you give me 20 minutes to like just or an hour and teach me how you're doing marketing, what advice you have? And they're like, yeah, sure, because there's an incentive there. They gave you $5,000, and now they're gonna, they want to see that money turn into something, right?
Okay. And how long did that sort of fundraising process take from literally creating the pitch deck and getting advisors and all that stuff to actually having the money in the bank? Like, what was the overall timeline, and what was the breakdown? Like, what areas took longer than you probably expected, and which areas was like quick?
Um, it took um let's see, longer to make our deck than I thought it should have. I think that's because we were like um, learning a lot about deck design while we were doing it, and I'm still not sure I'm an expert there. But I think that took a while. I think one thing we should have done is focus on like getting just like a deck template, and that would have saved us more time instead of like going back to an artist every single time we wanted to change a page. That was like kind of a waste of time, and it was like sort of unnecessary. Um, I think. Um, on fundraising, it I guess it finding investors didn't take so long, but like I've spent the better part of my career like networking, so
Mm.
I already had these like types of relationships where if I didn't know the investor, I knew somebody who knew the investor and they could make the introduction. I think had I just been starting off fresh, that would have probably been by far the longest.
Okay. Like how long would you say the whole process then? Like 6 months, 3 months, 12 months from start to finish?
About 4 months from start to finish. And the reason it took longer, I think, than it should have is as we were in the middle or like about to close, as we were going through the legal process, everybody got COVID. I had COVID, my co founder had COVID, our investor had COVID, our lawyer had COVID. I think their lawyer, our investor's lawyer had COVID. Literally everybody got COVID. And so everything just kind of stopped and we were all just sick for a while. It was pretty bad.
Okay. And how many in-person meetings, if any, did you have? Because remember at the start when we were talking about Roma games, you said you had like a quick 20-minute call with the investor. So that was obviously a virtual meeting. But how many physical meetings did you have?
We didn't have any.
Okay.
It was all virtual, yeah.
It
Because
was all
our
virtual.
investor is based in Singapore, and Barcelona.
Okay.
So yeah, we didn't have any in person.
Did they ever push for physical, or was they just happy with virtual meetings?
No, they were happy with virtual. I think because of like the COVID stuff that was going on, virtual was a bit better. I think had we tried this, um, you know, 3 years ago, it would have had to have been probably in person.
Yeah. Okay. And like, what was that like? Pitching virtually? Because was the call that initial, pitch call? Was that literally just like a phone call, or was that like a call where you could share your screen?
Um, in most cases, it was a phone call. I'm sorry, it was a video call where I would be sharing my screen, and then it's just like like you practice in like in school with like a pitch, right? It's like, okay, here's our deck, and then you practiced, you know your lines. I did everything, almost everything with my co-founder, so he knew his lines, and then you just go through the slides and you talk about your vision. There's a very clear formula for it, and they've heard the formula and they know what to expect, and they want to hear where did you come from. Why do you want to? What's the problem you're trying to solve in games? Why do you want to solve this problem? Like, what's the marketing? How are you going to solve this problem? And how much money do you need? And then you answer questions, and it's like such a set process that they've heard it. In fact, it was only in the case of play where they deliberately asked us like not to go through the deck that way. They're like, okay, I've seen the deck. I know what to expect. Let's just talk about like in detail. Like, here's all my questions that I have for you. Like, here, let's make this more interesting. So you don't have to do the same song and dance. Some investors want the song and dance. Others don't. I don't really have a preference one way or the other. But you have to know your pitch and you have to like have practiced it. And for the love of all things holy, like make sure you like have shared the deck with somebody in advance and they can like who knows what they're talking about and can give you advice on whether or not it's a good deck or if you need to rework it. And in our case, we definitely had to rework our deck. We made a bunch of mistakes.
Okay.
Um, yeah.
So did you rework it before you got the investment, or I mean, like before you got that particular meeting, or was it like during that sort of process? Did you share it with like a friend or someone?
We yeah, I mean we were constantly like working on and tweaking the deck. Um, we sent it out after we made the first version, and then we got some feedback, and then made a bunch of changes. Then we did a few calls, got some feedback, made some more changes. Deleted some information, added like for instance, we weren't really sure if we wanted to work on NFTs, so like we put a little thing in there like we might do NFTs, and we got some immediate feedback that was like unless you're actually doing NFTs and like you're really into it, don't put it into your deck because it'll just confuse people. So we took that out. Um,
So basically, be
yeah.
concise with what you want to do.
Yes, precisely.
Okay. And what advice would you give to people looking to raise money for their company?
I guess it really depends. Like, um, firstly, I think it's important to know what you want to build and why. Make sure you have the right team to do it. This is like feedback that a lot of people have. Like a lot of people will um, put together a team and it's like missing a key component. So like they won't have an engineer, or it's like a bunch of business people who don't have an artist or an engineer, or it's an engineer and an artist, but they don't have a business person. Like you kind of need like all of the pieces to be a little bit more palatable. Most like in general, unless you already have a game that's kind of working, most investors are investing in the team and not in the game itself, right? Like you'll be convinced that your game idea is a great idea and it might be a great idea, but they know pretty well that most of like the games that you start with are not the games that end up making your studio money. For instance, we pitched a game that's like, Animal Crossing, and we worked on that for a few months and then killed it because it was clearly not working. And as much as we believed in it, like they knew that that was probably going to happen, and they were right. Um, so I think a big thing is like you have to have like the right DNA for your studio. Make sure you check all the boxes when it comes to it.
Okay. And so I think you said you raised $1.5 million for Roma Games. What does that allow you to do? And what's the sort of predicted burn rate or sort of time frame that you've got that for?
Sure. So we raised actually just like 1.1 million. And what that allows us to do is a bit of user acquisition, and then essentially work for 2 years on figuring out what project we should launch. So that gets us a few engineers, um, a few artists, and a game designer, and then the founding team. We don't have an office. We don't have like a lot of perks because we're a pretty small, scrappy startup. But we can run user acquisition tests if we need to like test like a game idea or an art style or something, and then test the actual game to get some good KPIs, pay for marketing, etc. So overall, I would say that gives us about a good year, probably about a year and a half of developing out different game ideas before we need to raise money again.
Okay. And do you have plans of raising money, or is it a matter of if you need to?
I think at this point we're definitely looking to raise again. I think we've decided that the project that we're working on now is probably going to be somewhat expensive. We're going to need a lot more art and some other things. Um, so I think we are reasonably certain that we're going to be raising again, but we have a little bit of time before that actually happens. So we can work on our project a bit more. And if it actually takes off without raising, I think we'll be, equally happy. But um, in that case, we'll have to run a little bit more scrappy. If we do raise money, then we can start to do like really cool stuff that we'd like, add all the features, think really big, move really fast, hire a bunch of awesome people. It's um, it kind of just depends on where the cards uh, where the cards fall, if that's the phrase. Um, when it comes to like what we actually end up doing, I wouldn't say I necessarily have like a big preference other than I really want this to succeed.
Okay. And why did you choose to raise funds versus bootstrapping it?
In order to get the talent that we needed, I knew that we were going to need to raise a bit of money. Like the CTO needed a good salary. And the other two folks that came on board, like one of them just had a baby, and the other one, although he didn't, he needed to be making some money so that he could pay his rent. I think we also wanted to make sure that we could hire, good um, other good talent and run user acquisition and not have to worry about counting every penny. Like I want to be able to run some tests and have them fail, and that and not really worry about breaking the bank every time I do that. I want to make sure that I can acquire um, get it like a good MacBook for all the employees if they like need that to work on instead of skimping on that kind of stuff that's just going to hold them back.
Yeah, of course. And what did you have before you raised the fund? Because some companies, they've got a product and they've launched it and it's not quite going well. Yeah, some people, they literally just have an idea. Like, what was ready, and what did you show to the investor? And they was like, yeah, we want to invest in this startup and we want to invest in you guys. What did he bring to the table outside of obviously experience?
We had a concept and a bunch of market research, um, and a really rough prototype that kind of illustrated the idea. And that's about all we had. We didn't have any metrics, so I
Okay.
think if we had metrics, it would have probably made things a lot easier.
Okay, and that rough prototype, did you create that yourselves, or did you hire some developer just to get some rough prototype working just for the investors? How did that come about?
Um, we our CTO built it with our chief product. So yeah, we built that all in house.
Okay, and so when will Roma Games launch its first game? And do you have any details for or at least your predicted first game? Because you said you're running a bunch of experiments right now, and you're just sort of just experimenting with what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, so we did actually launch a game previously, but we just like killed it and I think we took it out of the App Store. So technically we already launched it. It was a 2D Animal Crossing knockoff. Our next game we're anticipating we will launch probably in, let me think. I would look for some stuff in December. We're gonna try and do like maybe a closed beta. And then January, February, we'll move towards maybe an open beta. And then springtime, we'll probably have something that's on the App Store.
Okay, so not long at all then for it to come out. What's the name of that Animal Crossing sort of game that you took off?
It was called Shopcraft.
Shopcraft, did you say?
Yes.
Shopcraft. Okay, I'm gonna have a quick Google after our podcast. So, how has working at companies like the behemoth Disney, the advertising company Chartboost, Kolibri, formed your approach at Roma Games? Because you're a veteran in effectively in the gaming industry. You've been to loads of different companies, seen all sorts of stuff. Because when you started, was that what, 010 or 11, or maybe even before that? It was in the early days of the mobile gaming industry. So you've seen that grow from a little thing to the thing now. So, like, how has that formed your approach, going into Roma games? What advice would you give as a result of all this experience?
Um, let's see. I think there's like a bunch of different things that were um, helpful. I think learning how to manage a team was an extremely valuable experience from the earlier ones, and that's something that like kind of informed me. I think I learned about how to do data-driven like marketing tests, and that's been a big guidepost for me. I think understanding the different systems that work in a game, what are the core loops, the meta, how can you monetize them, what are the key features you need to use when you're creating an MVP. That's all stuff that Colibri I think taught me. Um, I think understanding how to speak to artists and how to handle IP holders and talk up to people to manage up is something that I learned while I was mostly at Disney and maybe a bit at Chartboost, where like you have a boss and or somebody you're trying to pitch to, and the pitching skill that I had to do a lot of while I was at Chartboost, like that is super super helpful. Like understanding how to like get up in front of people you have never met who don't know you and like very quickly explain a concept to them and get them to like that concept or at least like you. That's like such a valuable experience that I think anybody who is looking to succeed in any sort of business, like learning how to do a bit of sales is like really really helpful. Um, Being able to sound confident when you're explaining something and convince someone that they should buy whatever that thing is, buy into your idea, buy into you, that sort of stuff, I think really, really pushes somebody along when it comes to the entrepreneurial experience, when it comes to the management experience. So, if you want to raise money, yeah, sure, you gotta sound like you know what you're doing and that you have a great idea, but also when you're talking to your employees, like you have to make sure like I'm going to sell this idea, I need them to be on board with it, and let's make sure that we can figure out the objections in advance. I think that's, as a founder, as a CEO on like the business side, like for me that of course is incredibly important. um, and then just familiarizing yourself with any and all of like the various tech things, knowing what might be some problems on the back end or things that people are dealing with Unity or their art pipelines. Like that's all stuff that you kind of like you start to absorb while you're at some of these other studios.
Okay.
And I do have to apologize. I think I have to go in about 8 minutes. I'm really sorry.
That's no problem. That was literally the last question that I had on my list. So what I was gonna say, before we wrap up, like, is there anything else you wanna tell everyone about Rome again? Because there isn't that much information. So the questions that I've asked, it was limited based on the limited knowledge I, had about it. Because obviously there's not really any games out right now for it. I don't think there's any footage or any artwork that you've put out there or that I could find. So do you want to talk more about Roma games before we wrap up? Just like give some more information.
Yeah, so Romer Games is, as you know, it's a brand new studio set up in Berlin. Our objective is to make genre-defining games. So we really want to make games that are like hybrids of new genres, defining them, innovating the mechanics, the worlds they're in, the like all of the attributes of it. We want to challenge all of the preconceived notions you have about those genres and what it means for that genre. And we are currently hiring. So if you go to our website, you can see we're currently hiring actually a 3D artist. Um, but we have new job listings all the time for new positions as we're expanding, which is great. So please check us out at roamergames.com. That is ROAMER games.com. Um, and overall, I think you're going to see some pretty awesome stuff coming out of our little studio over the next few months that we're really excited to share with everyone. Likewise, if you get to our careers page and you don't see something listed that is your specialty, always feel free to submit an open application. We take those very seriously and look at every single one. And when the time is right, we'd love to have folks come out and join us. But other than that, I mean, I think that's us in a nutshell. I want to thank you so much for having me on and letting me tell a little bit about my story.
No problem, Nate. I mean, thank you for joining me on the podcast. Really appreciate it. And what I'd love to do is when you do launch a game, hopefully in the next few months or so, have you on again. Talk about how things have changed. Obviously, about the game that you've launched, and just get people hearing about how things have progressed in over those few months, and the lessons that you've learned from that. Because I feel like the lessons you will learn in a few months, leading up to a launch of a game in your own startup is going to be immense compared to, let's say, 2 years at an already established company where they've already got processes, that keep the wheels turning.
Oh, absolutely. If you'll have me on, I'd love to be there.
Yeah, that would be great. So thank you, Nate. I really appreciate it. Or like I said, I'll get all the links, including Roma Games, including whatever it is, all the links off you that you feel are relevant. I'll put them in the description, and feel free to check them out, guys. If you like the podcast, give it a 5-star rating, and I'll see everyone soon, and I'll see you soon, Nate. Take care.
Take care. Thank you so much.
Bye.